Chapter 28, Reproductive System, Screencast 1. This is the first screencast for this chapter, and there will be a total of 6 screencasts. The first screencast will be introducing concepts related to the reproductive system generally, and then focus primarily on the ovaries of female reproductive system and also the ovarian cycle. Now, when it comes to reproductive strategies, it is important to keep something in mind. Generally, there are 2 strategies that are there. One strategy is to have lots and lots of offspring and hope some of them live to survive and actually reproduce. And the other is to have fewer offspring and take care of them for a longer time. And that is the model that we see in humans and most other mammals for the most part. Now, the first thing we have to address are gonads. And in women, those are going to be the ovaries. In males, they will be the testes. And they actually produce sex cells called the gametes, and those are actually the sperm and the egg. Together, at fertilization, they are going to unite to initiate the formation of a new individual. One thing that I will put a pretty significant emphasis on will actually be the sex hormones, and those are hormones that impact maturation, development, and also regulate the activity of reproductive organs. Also, we'll be looking at accessory reproductive organs, and those examples would be the ducts to carry gametes away from the gonads, towards the site of fertilization in females, and towards outside of the body for males. Now, this is a very important concept here, and I do not plan on going into the details of meiosis versus mitosis, but it is important to distinguish between diploid versus haploid. A cell that is diploid has 23 pairs or a total of 46 chromosomes. Now, a haploid cell has 23 chromosomes, not 23 pairs. And so this is important because what we will see is one set of chromosomes coming from each of the gametes, one set from the egg, and the other set will be coming from the sperm upon fertilization. Now, the most important hormone is going to be gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and this actually is responsible for the initiation of puberty. This, in turn, will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release 2 other hormones, and they are follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. Keep in mind, even though they are named after phases of the ovarian cycle, they are present in males and females, and we will come up with some strategies to distinguish between that along the way. Now, at this point in time, at the onset of puberty, this is when the gonads begin to produce significant levels of sex hormones, and this will in turn start the process of gamete and sexual maturation. Now, as noted previously, gametes are produced by males and females produce and release a single gamete monthly, and that is an oocyte. Males, on the other hand, produce large numbers of gametes, up to 100 million per day. They are not stored for a long period of time, and if they are actually not expelled from the body, they will be resorbed. Now, here we're starting off with the female reproductive system, and the first organ that we're going to address is going to be the ovaries. Here we see a sagittal section through the female pelvis, and we actually see the primary reproductive organs, and this screencast will continue to focus on the ovaries, follicular development, oogenesis, and the ovarian cycle. Now, the accessory reproductive organs would be the uterine tubes, the uterus, the vagina, external genitalia, and the mammary glands. Now, when we look at the ovaries, we need to keep in mind that ovarian follicles are the site of oocyte production and the release of sex hormones. Ovaries are paired organs, and they are found within the pelvic cavity lateral to the uterus. When we look at the size of an ovary in an adult, it's slightly larger than the size of an almond. Now, keep in mind, and this is very characteristic of female reproductive anatomy and physiology, that where a woman is with respect to her cycle, that is going to have an impact on numerous things. This is one of those. So there is a difference in the size of the ovaries dependent upon what part of the menstrual cycle and ovarian cycle or pregnancy the woman is experiencing at the time. Now, we look at a germinal epithelium, and this is a simple cuboidal epithelial layer that surrounds the actual ovary. There is also a dense connective tissue capsule that's deep to this germinal epithelium and is known as the tunica albuginea. You will not be responsible for identifying the tunica albuginea on the ovary. Now, deep to the tunica albuginea is the outer cortex. This contains highly cellular connective tissue and the ovarian follicles. The inner area, the medulla, is composed of areolar connective tissue. It also will have branches of ovarian blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. And we can actually see that here. So here we basically see the follicles, and then within the medullary region, we actually see vessels and such. Now, the next few slides are focusing on ovarian follicles, and they consist of the oocyte surrounded by follicular cells. The job of these cells is to support the oocyte, and thousands of them are found within the cortex. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is go through the 6 main types of ovarian follicles, and it is important to realize that they are representing different stages of development. The first is the primordial follicle. This is the most primitive type of ovarian follicle, and there are approximately 1.5 million of them present at birth. Then we have the primary follicle. This actually will form from a maturing primordial follicle. Primary follicles will actually secrete estrogen as they mature, and this will actually begin to start changes in the lining of the uterus. The third type is a secondary follicle, and this will form from the primary follicle. And now we have a primary oocyte with many layers of granulosa cells. There are also special cells called thecal cells, and they are on the periphery of the follicle, and their job is actually to help control follicular development. Now, they also will be secreting androgens, and they will be converted to estrogen by the granulosa cells. The next type of follicle is an antral follicle, and this forms from the primary follicle. The primary oocyte, many layers of granulosa cells, and we start to see the beginning of a fluid-filled space known as the antrum. In the antrum, serous fluid actually increases as the time for ovulation gets closer. During this process, the oocyte is actually forced to one side of the follicle, and the oocyte begins to be surrounded by clusters of follicle cells, and this is called a cumulus ophorus. Then we have a mature follicle, and this is originating from the secondary follicle. This actually contains a secondary oocyte. So now it's going to be surrounded by the zona pellucida and a corona radiata. There are many layers of granulosa cells, a very fluid-filled antrum, and the important thing to keep in mind here is that meiosis 1 has been completed. Now, this now means that it will be arrested during the second meiotic metaphase, and this is something that happens 1 time per month with respect to the mature follicle. The last is the corpus luteum, and this forms from the remnants of the follicle after ovulation. This acts as a temporary endocrine organ, and it is going to be secreting the sex hormones progesterone and estrogen. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the lining of the uterus is especially sensitive to progesterone. And once we start to see progesterone, we're going to see it begin to build the buildup of the uterine lining. Really what's happening here is preparation of the uterus for possible implantation of a fertilized oocyte. Now, next is a corpus albicans, and this is formed from the regressed corpus luteum. It really is just white connective scar tissue, and this mostly will be resorbed. Now, here we're basically talking about oogenesis, and there's a couple of things that I want to put an emphasis on, especially those that are different from males. Now, a lot of reproductive capacity in females actually occurs before birth. And one thing that you also will notice, we will actually be putting a timeline on the reproductive capacity of women. So prior to birth, the oogenesis are diploid, and keep in mind that's 23 pairs of chromosomes, and they are the origin of oocytes. There will be mitotic divisions, oogonia, producing primary oocytes, which are diploid cells. Primary oocytes start the process of meiosis, but it is arrested in prophase 1. So here we basically start off with the oogonium, and here is our primary oocyte. Note that it is arrested in prophase 1, and notice we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or a total of 46. So now this is considered to be diploid, not haploid. Now, I'll be putting more emphasis on the oogenesis as opposed to the development of the follicle. Now, during childhood, ovaries are inactive. It houses primordial follicles, and there actually is a significant decrease in the number of primordial follicles, and this is known as atresia. Now, monthly, from puberty to menopause, up to about 20 primordial follicles are stimulated to mature into primary follicles every month. Some primary follicles mature into secondary follicles. Primary follicles that do not mature undergo atresia. So here we can actually see what's going on. We're starting off with that primary oocyte. And remember, this is still diploid. Typically, only one antral follicle develops into a mature follicle where the primary oocyte actually completes the first meiotic division to produce a polar body and a secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte is now haploid cell, meaning that it contains 23 chromosomes only, and that is arrested in the second meiotic metaphase. Now, note that there is also a non-viable polar body, and that accounts for the other 23 chromosomes. Now, if the secondary oocyte is fertilized, it completes the second meiotic division and becomes an ovum. If the secondary oocyte is not fertilized, it degenerates. And here along the way, we can basically see the progression of the follicles. We start off with a primordial follicle, and then that becomes the primary follicle. And then we look at the secondary to the antral. And then notice we now have the mature follicle, and that actually has the secondary oocyte inside, which is actually haploid now. Here we see ovulation, formation of the corpus luteum, and then regression into the corpus albicans. So basically, we just walked through the entire ovarian cycle with an image, and now we're going to take another look at it a little differently. Now, oogenesis, this is the maturation of a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. And this actually occurs in stages over the life of a female. Now, before birth, the ovary contains primordial germ cells that are called oogonium. Now, these are diploid cells, and they actually divide by mitosis, and that is simple cell division, to produce primary oocytes. Cells start meiosis, and meiosis is a type of cellular reproduction in which the genetic material is halved. But once again, this meiosis is arrested in prophase 1. The cells now are primary oocytes. Approximately at birth, there are 1.5 million follicles within the ovarian cortex at birth. And this is going to basically remain arrested in prophase 1 until after puberty. Now, during childhood, ovaries are inactive and there are actually no developing follicles. They undergo what is known as atresia, and this is a regression of some of the primordial follicles. At the time of puberty, we are no longer anywhere near 1.5 million. We're now out at about 400,000 follicles that are remaining in the ovary. So here we basically see that there has been a regression, and we're actually talking about a limitation to the lifespan of female reproductive capacity. Now, from puberty to menopause, the hypothalamus release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This stimulates the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, the levels of these hormones vary in a cyclical pattern and produces a monthly sequence of events known as the ovarian cycle. The phases of the ovarian cycle are the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. Now, we will be using a standard 28-day cycle, but please keep in mind that there is a lot of individual variation here. You're not responsible for knowing what happens on the various days. We're just using that as a frame of reference so that you have an idea of the timeline of this cycle. During days 1 through 13 of the ovarian cycle, around 20 primordial follicles will be stimulated to mature into primary follicles. This is done by luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Remember, we have different types of cells within the follicle, and at this point, the granulosa cells release inhibin. This is a hormone that helps inhibit further follicle-stimulating hormone production, and what it actually does, it prevents the formation of excessive follicles. Few primary follicles actually mature into secondary follicles. Usually only one matures to a vesicular follicle, and during this phase, the volume of fluid increases within the antrum of the follicle. At this time, as we saw previously, the oocyte is actually forced to one side of the follicle. Now, when we look at the primary oocyte, which is in the antral follicle, we're looking at finishing meiosis 1, and two cells are formed. One is a polar body. This is non-functional, does not receive a lot of cytoplasm, and will regress. The other cell is actually derived from the primary oocyte. It receives the majority of the cytoplasm, and this is what actually becomes the secondary oocyte. Now remember, this secondary oocyte is haploid. It will reach metaphase 2, but then meiosis will be arrested yet again, and meiosis will only be completed if the egg is actually fertilized. If not, it breaks down within 24 hours. Now, ovulation, this is the release of the secondary oocyte from a mature follicle, and this typically occurs on day 14 of that 28-day cycle. Generally, only one ovary ovulates each month. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that when we talk about ovulation, it is induced by a peak in luteinizing hormone. The antrum increases in size and swelling. It expands until the ovarian surface thins, and eventually there is rupture of the follicle, expending the secondary oocyte. The other thing that it is important to address, what are the primary hormones during the follicular phase? Now, we will see both estrogen and progesterone, but during the follicular phase, the primary hormone will be estrogen. Now, we just addressed ovulation, and ovulation will be triggered by a spike in luteinizing hormone. And we are now in the luteal phase. And the remaining follicle actually becomes what we refer to as the corpus luteum. This occurs on days 15 to 28 of the cycle, and quite often the corpus luteum is described as a temporary endocrine gland. It is secreting both progesterone and estrogen. Now, remember, the primary hormone during the luteal phase is progesterone. And this is important. Remember, this has taken place post-ovulation, and there is the potential for the egg to be fertilized. So once we start to see increasing levels of progesterone, this signals the buildup of the uterine lining and to prepare for a fertilized oocyte. Now, the lifespan of 10 to 13 days of the corpus luteum if the oocyte is not fertilized. At the end, the corpus luteum will regress. This results in a drop in the amount of progesterone and estrogen that's being secreted. This will trigger the shedding of the uterine lining, and this is known as menstruation. Shed lining during the menses, and this actually marks the end of the luteal phase. Now, menopause, this is what occurs when women cease cycling for an entire year. They are not pregnant or have any other medical condition. They are just no longer cycling. The onset of menopause can vary, but typically it occurs around 45 to 55. Now, at this time, there are no more ovarian follicles. So there are no follicles to mature. There's going to be no more progesterone and estrogen because there are no more follicles. And at this time, because there is no progesterone and estrogen, we are not going to see any growth of the uterine lining. And also, this will mean there are no further menstrual periods. Now here we can actually look at this particular diagram, and it's walking through the phases. So here we're looking on the blue, that's most of the follicular phase, and then the pinkish will be the late follicular ovulation and luteal phase. So let's kind of walk through what's actually happening overall. So the hypothalamus is secreting gonadotropin releasing hormone, and this stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce and release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, these hormones play an important role in stimulating follicular development. Maturing ovarian follicles actually secrete inhibin, and this, remember, will inhibit follicle-stimulating hormone production, and low levels of estrogen, which initially inhibit both the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Now, keep in mind, during the follicular phase, estrogen is the primary hormone. Now, remember, estrogen will also assist with the development of the mature follicle. Mature follicles produce a large threshold amount of estrogen, and this stimulates the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. We now see a surge in luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, and this actually is responsible for ovulation. Once ovulation is completed, the corpus luteum forms under the influence of luteinizing hormone. And remember, the corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine organ, and it is secreting large amounts of mostly progesterone. Now, estrogen and inhibin are also released, but we need to remember that the primary hormone during the luteal phase is actually progesterone. And then this process will continue until an egg is fertilized or menopause takes place. Now, this last slide is talking about ovarian cancer, and this is a significant and primary malignancy within the ovary. Remember, ovaries are about the size of an almond in an adult, and previously I had a student that sent me an image of a family member that actually had ovarian cancer, and the image showed that the size of the tumor in the ovary was the size of a golf ball. So we're talking about something relatively large. Now, this may originate from oocytes, the connective tissue, or surface epithelium. It is the fifth most common cancer in women, and the real issue here is the initial symptoms are very nonspecific. They consist, but are not limited to, constipation, urinary urgency, abdominal swelling, pelvic pain, indigestion, nausea, back pain, and weight changes. So there are many, many things that can actually cause these symptoms. So once again, this is one of the reasons why it is very difficult to detect ovarian cancer early on when the prognosis for treating it is actually quite good. Also, there are no reliable tests or screen for ovarian cancer, and that is why it is often detected late. Typically, the treatment involves surgery and or chemotherapy.